From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern.
Now it's the Senate's turn. Leadership on both sides pushing to pass the debt ceiling bill through the chamber ahead of the rapidly approaching deadline.
Josh Bolten of the business...
I am almost certainly going to vote for it, as much as I am unenthusiastic.
I think it's a missed opportunity, so I'll be a no.
I think we could vote it through. Maybe not today, but maybe by sometime tomorrow.
And Josh Bolten of the Business Roundtable will be with us to talk about how the business community is looking at the debt deal. Also with us, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, a state that's risen in electoral importance for Democrats. We'll ask him all about it.
Also today, the French ambassador to the U.S. has arrived in Washington. We'll get his take on the country's ongoing support for Ukraine. So, Anne-Marie, here we are again on the threshold of another important vote, and it seems like this actually could happen as soon as this evening in the Senate. Things are starting to move quickly here.
Yes, potential for this to happen this evening. Does look like it. But when does it actually end, Joe? That's going to be the big question.
Great question. A lot of talk about amendments, and if any of them have a chance of passing. Looks like the answer is no, but we've got to go through the process.
Exactly. And leading up into this moment, here is what we've heard from senators all day on the Hill. Take a listen.
I got an open mind. I want to see how the amendment process goes in the Senate before making a final decision.
We're creating a very bad tool here. In the long run, if it becomes normal that we threaten to sink the entire economy unless we get our way on a budget.
I want to see something done for working people that actually puts this economy on a foundation where working people can get ahead and power our economic growth. And I just don't think this agreement even tries to do that. The deal is what it is, and I'm disappointed in it, but I don't see any reason to drag this out at this point.
This isn't the piece of legislation I would write, but at the same time, we can't risk defaulting on the full faith and credit of the United States.
Everyone trying to get inside the heads of senators as we get set for the vote. And joining us around the table, two people who can help us with that to discuss. Our White House and politics reporter Laura Davison is here, as well as Bloomberg Government's Congress reporter Jack Fitzpatrick. Jack, what's the latest on this? We're talking about an accelerated timetable, it looks like here. I know we're waiting for a timing deal, right? But we could have votes as soon as tonight.
Yeah, our colleague Ari Natter just caught up with Senator Ben Cardin, who said his expectation, and this is not written in stone, is they could start votes around 6 p.m. to this evening.
1 hour from now.
And that could be between 8 and 15 amendment votes. So this could be a middle-of-the-night passage vote if they get all 100 senators to agree to that unanimous consent time agreement to speed this up. If they didn't have everybody on board, the Senate moves so slowly that they wouldn't even meet the deadline. So this is a matter of getting literally all 100 people to agree on amendments, assurances about future spending plans, and then everybody signs off on the time for a vote.
What kind of amendments could we see, Laura?
A bunch of different things. You're really seeing some of the stuff that's in the bill. So things on permitting, that Mountain Valley pipeline. You have some Democrat on Democratic action here. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia wants to strip that language out that his colleague, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, wanted. Also seeing things related to some of the hardliners, the people that you expect occasionally will draw out some of these things. Rand Paul wants big cuts to spending, as well as other things related to military funding as well, because a lot of the defense hawks are concerned that even though there was an increase of about 3% in military spending, that when you compare it to inflation, it amounts to an actual cut.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we spoke today with Senator Lindsey Graham on Capitol Hill. He had great concerns about the level of defense spending in this package, and he was ready to do something about it. Listen to what he said.
I'm talking to the President Zelensky at 1 o'clock today. He's confused. I want him to know that this budget deal does not take off the table the ability to help Ukraine with their liberation efforts, that there will be more money coming through a supplemental. I want our own military to hear that there's a chance to repair some of the damage. And if I don't hear that, we'll be here to Tuesday, and every day I'll offer an amendment to not default.
be here till Tuesday, I'm assuming, is not going to work with the leadership here. Do we assume Mitch McConnell had a conversation with the gentleman from South Carolina about this today?
I think all the leadership are talking about his demands, and he was actually joined by Susan Collins, who's the top Republican on the Appropriations Committee, saying she also wants assurances. Remember that this bill creates spending caps, and as soon as Washington creates spending caps, they start talking about how to get out of the spending caps. So they are talking about assurances that they will get cap-exempt spending for defense purposes. That's what the defense hawks are talking about. Now, Democrats have also said, well, if you're going to do that, there should be other non-defense cap-exempt funds. So they are having conversations not only about amendments, but promises that they may put in writing regarding cap-exempt supplemental spending bills and what they would apply to in the future.
So it sounds like potentially we could see side deals coming out of individuals making these amendments and having these votes. What happens in terms of any of these amendments actually getting added to the bill? Or is that just not going to happen?
There is almost no chance, because remember, if the Senate amends the bill, they add one of these amendments, it has to go back to the House for the vote. They got to call all the House members back, and then they're really in trouble of meeting that June 5th deadline. So basically, everyone's come out and said, we know these amendments aren't going to pass, but we're going to go through this process just so everyone can get their time in the sun. They can issue their press release saying that they fought for this issue that ultimately they didn't get.
This is fascinating, and it's partly why people either don't understand or hate Washington. We're looking at a live view here of Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia making the case for his amendment here on that pipeline we talked about that runs through Joe Manchin's state that was dropped into this bill at the last moment. But he knows that that amendment is going to fail. This is all messaging, right? We spoke with Senator Mike Braun of Indiana earlier today. He even referred to his amendment as a messaging opportunity because they realize they bust the whole deal if this gets passed.
Yeah, I mean, messaging can be important. That's a big part of politics. Yeah. But the fact is the leadership strategy is maybe you can get an amendment vote if it's going to fail. And actually part of the negotiations are what do we set the threshold at? Do you get an amendment vote where it's adopted with a simple majority or 60 votes? Senator Graham was pushing for an amendment to increase the defense spending level. That could get some numbers behind it.
Yes, right.
If they allow that, they may set it at a 60-vote threshold, again, because the purpose for allowing these amendments is to get people to have their opportunity to make their point, but it's got to fail so that they don't have to send this back to the House.
Okay, so it doesn't go back to the House likely. It passes potentially this evening or early hours of tomorrow morning. I'm sorry for both of you that potentially will have to be up and
You're staying up for that,
and
too.
covering for this. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Only if Joe stays up. I'm willing to also stay up. What happens, though, when it comes to the appropriation committees later in the year? Isn't this where the big fights are going to happen?
This is the big broad fight. There are 1,000 little or big fights. Again, supplemental cap-exempt spending bills for Ukraine, for disaster aid, potentially for border security. That's going to be a big fight. The tricks that appropriators can use to take credit for the savings of the COVID funding rescissions, that then if they include that in the appropriations bills, they can count that against their cap and actually spend more than the caps. There's going to be some very complicated stuff to, one, try to get around the caps, but two, try to get 12 appropriations bills done and avoid a shutdown. And again, this includes something that if they are relying on a stopgap measure past January 1st, it actually cuts everything by 1%. So nobody's happy. So the pressure is on to sort through all sorts of deals on funding the government and also the attempts to get around these caps that are in the debt limit bill.
So for those who are playing along on their home games here, we're waiting for a timing deal. As soon as we get that, we have a sense of how long voting might last. Then everybody gets on an airplane. President Biden then could sign this as soon as tomorrow.
Yes, he could. He's traveling this weekend. He could also, if they want to make a big show of it, wait until Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, have a splash. But just to give you a sense of kind of how much, all the lawmakers involved are thinking about the politics of this and the messaging of it, is Chuck Schumer came out of his office where they're kind of figuring out the last minute deal, and he just to do a photo op. He pumped his fist, kind of did a mission accomplished, just to get that photo in the light of day because they may not finish voting until 4 a.m. this morning. So everyone's thinking about how do we claim their piece of credit for this deal going forward. Biden will do the same on how he signs this bill.
Great inside info, great color as we're finally here at the precipice of what appears to be the big vote in the Senate. Laura and Jack, we thank you. As always, a great conversation, a great panel. Coming up, we'll get more insight on the debt deal from Democratic Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. He's next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
President Biden and his negotiating team have accomplished the least bad outcome we could have hoped for, given how extreme the demands of the House Republican majority were.
That was Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware speaking earlier today with Bloomberg on the debt deal that's set to get a vote this evening in the Senate. Joining us now is the Assistant Democratic Leader in the U.S. House. That would be Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Of course, this bill has already passed the House. That's why the congressman is back in his home district now. And Congressman, we welcome you. It's great to see you again. I wonder, did you have to hold your nose when you voted for this bill? There were great concerns about work requirements being added. The CBC issued a very stern statement calling it cruel and ill-advised, but I know it also took on a different form in the final deal. What does it mean for the people of South Carolina?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. No, I did not have to hold my nose at all. I think that when you get in the beginning of these processes, we always see people going to their corners. And the CBC, of which I'm a proud member, we had some real concerns from what was being talked about. But after those negotiations got underway, and I had conversations with Steve Ricchetti and Shalonda Young and with the president himself. In fact, last Friday, we had a long telephone conversation about this issue. And when I saw where they were going, increasing able-bodiedness from 49 up to 54, but at the same time bringing in additional veterans, people who are homeless. They all came into this process. And so I thought that was a real good trade-off. And so I'm very pleased with what the end product is, and that's why I enthusiastically voted for it last night. And 317 others, 16 others.
Congressman, did the White House seek to try to downplay what they believed was a substantial victory out of this negotiation and not try to go out on the airwaves and trumpet up that they actually feel like they won in this negotiation out of fear of Republicans not voting?
Well, remember, our having passed this bill last night got us down to just the scoring zone. But we have not crossed the goal line yet. That won't come until the Senate finishes its work. So it's not good to start spiking the ball before you get to the goal line.
So you won't share that tactic because the Senate hasn't voted, but it's fair to assume that was a tactic.
Well, I don't know. I'm very comfortable with this legislation. Of course, if I had had my way and we controlled all three bodies of the Congress, it would be different. But remember, 51% of the House controlled by Republicans, 51% of the Senate controlled by Democrats. That's the classic definition of what you need to do to find common ground.
Well, Congressman, I'm kind of left scratching my head here on why we're having this conversation at all, because I was told when I was asking a number of different lawmakers and people smarter than I am, why don't we get rid of the debt ceiling? And I know that Senator Van Hollen had legislation to do just that. The answer was always because this is a check on our spending. It's an opportunity, an inflection point to reconsider our budgeting and our priorities and maybe even cut spending. Now that we've seen that this did nothing to cut spending, certainly not to the level that Republicans were proposing, do we need to ask that question again? What is the point of this? Why not reform the debt ceiling, align it with the budget year, the fiscal year, or get rid of it altogether?
Well, you're talking my language here. I've been saying that ever since I've been in the Congress. We do not need to have this debt ceiling. We need to get rid of it. I think what I said yesterday morning on one of the other networks, that we should get this vote done and then next week start working on eliminating this debt ceiling. I've been researching this thing ever since I've been in the Congress. Denmark is the only other democracy I know of that's got a debt limit. And even with Denmark, their debt limit is 3 times above their budget. 3 times above the budget. And here we are bumping up to a debt ceiling every year. In this instance, it'll be every 2 years. We need to get rid of that. We have those decisions that we're going to be making. Even now, we got to do the appropriation bills. We're going to be reauthorizing the farm bill. And so there's going to be, I know these caps are there. There are going to be all kinds of things being done to work around the caps, be creative under the caps, seeing what we can do to put out on emergency spending, all kinds of gimmicks we'll be using to get around these caps. We ought not be going through that. This debt limit makes no sense at all. We ought to get rid of it.
Well, you know, one of the big focuses now that the fact that we are almost over with this and the ceiling will be raised is everyone's obviously focusing on 2024. How does this deal potentially help President Biden as he looks for that reelection campaign for 2024?
You know, I've known Joe Biden for a long, long time. Back in 2020, during the campaign, when I made my endorsement, a lot of people told me it was the biggest mistake of my life. Now these same people are coming back to me saying, you were right, I was wrong. Why? Because they have always underestimated Joe Biden. They get carried away with the style. Joe Biden has a very understated style about him. He was not that way when he was running for the Senate for the first time, getting elected at the age of 29. He used to give some real stem winders for speeches. But, you know, as time goes on, you make adjustments to your new found intellect, and he's found it. He knows the Senate. He knows the Congress. He doesn't need to make headlines. He's always working on the best way to make some headway, and that's what he's done. Look at those 6 big bills that people say we had no chance of passing. The Rescue Act, the Infrastructure Bill, Science and Chips, Inflation Reduction Act, the PACT Act, the Safer Communities Act. All 6 of those bills we passed. Joe Biden signed into law, and all but 2 of them were bipartisan.
So, Congressman, is that your answer then? Is that your answer to critics who say that the president has not made good on promises to black voters who helped to get him into the White House? I know he's moving South Carolina to the front of the calendar, but we haven't seen action on voting reform and a lot of other issues that are important to your constituents.
No, we have not seen action on voting reform, but voting reform is something that this president is dedicated to. Remember, he's from Delaware. We built our relationship on Brown v. Board of Education. Those 5 cases that made up Brown v. Board of Education, one of them from South Carolina and one from Delaware, that's how I got to know him, working on those issues. So he has done it when he was chair of Judiciary, had the votes to get around the filibuster, could influence the president. He reauthorized that Voting Rights Act time and time again as a member of the Senate and as chair of Judiciary. So it's not his fault that we've got this filibuster. And so just because we don't have the bill, let's look and see why. And so you can't blame the president for an arcane Senate rule that we ought to get rid of.
Well, sir, you're in the House. Take that up with your colleagues on the Senate. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Coming up, our exclusive conversation with French ambassador to the United States, his first ever TV interview as he landed in Washington, D.C. Laurent Bili is next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Earlier, Joe and I had the opportunity to talk with French ambassador to the United States, Laurent Bili. He is new to Washington. His last posting is in Beijing, and that's where we began the conversation about China.
Well, I don't think that our positions are so different, in fact, because we have seen in the last week the vocabulary becoming closer. Like we are both speaking about de-risking. We also assume that China is both a partner sometimes, but also a competitor and even more systemic rival. So I think in that way we are very close. The only thing is that on the Taiwan issue, we had not really difference because the Taiwan issue is certainly key. But the point of the president was also that stepping up the issue of Taiwan was not necessary on our interest. Why? Because basically when you live in China, what I did in the last 3 years, you realize how much the issue is a hot issue. And so there is no middle ground between the West and China, and it's better maybe to keep things under control and protecting the status quo.
Do you think it's a new Cold War now between the West and China?
Not really a new Cold War, but on certain issue, we have to think that maybe the status quo is the best that we can achieve. But I want to also to reassure you that when he was in China, the president really called also on President Xi Jinping not to change the status quo by force and to refrain to escalate on Taiwan.
Do you believe a Chinese invasion, a mainland invasion of Taiwan, is inevitable?
I believe that the issue will stay important for China, and we have to do everything to protect the status quo.
I want to ask you about the situation in Ukraine. President Biden has made clear that the U.S. will support Ukraine in Russia's war effort for as long as it takes, the words he likes to use. Will France indefinitely support Ukraine in this effort?
Certainly, and I will say that we really appreciate the U.S. administration commitment in Ukraine. It's really, it was a wake-up call for NATO and for the transatlantic link to see that commitment on the U.S. side. The president just have a very important interview in Global Sec in Bratislava, and I think his point was very clear also that we are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
And thanks to Ambassador Bili for joining us at the table here. Welcome to Washington. Coming up, Josh Bolten of the Business Roundtable will join us with his group's take on the debt deal that could see a Senate vote tonight. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
The market should be encouraged by the bipartisan cooperation we've seen on the debt ceiling increase. I think the markets rightly have assumed some rationality and sanity on the part of the United States Congress. They may be misguided in that assumption, but I think there is a very, very good chance that we'll pass it in the next day or so.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut speaking with Bloomberg a bit earlier today, as the markets do seem to have found some relief from angst around this whole debt ceiling matter. We're getting close. Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lines is here with more. Hey, Kayleigh.
Well, Joe, arguably some areas of the market, like the equity market, never really seemed that concerned at all. Stocks largely ignored this issue, assuming ultimately that we were going to get a deal and the debt ceiling was going to be raised. But that wasn't the case in the bond market, especially in short-term T-bills. We saw yields soaring for maturities in June, north of 7% at one point last week when we were really questioning whether or not a deal was going to get done. And now you can actually see the sigh of relief reflected on the chart, with those yields coming back down to more normal levels around 5%. That T-bill curve has normalized, is no longer as distorted. And in longer-term Treasury bonds, you're seeing it too. The two-year yield down 3 days in a row by about 20 basis points since we got the deal, although arguably that is a little bit more about Federal Reserve policy than it is about relief about the debt ceiling. But you certainly can attribute relief about the debt ceiling and the idea that it is going to be raised when you look at credit default swaps. This is literally the cost of insuring against the U.S. failing to make a bond payment, rather. We had seen CDS swap prices to a record well beyond what we saw in 2011, signaling real fear out there that the U.S. could default. They have now come crashing back down to earth. We're sitting now south of 50 basis points. So clearly some calm in the market. Not to say we are fully out of in the clear yet. Of course, the Treasury is still saying that it may have to delay its regular 3- and 6-month bill auction on Monday if we don't have the debt ceiling raised in time. And of course, we still need the Senate to pass this thing. This is something that the Business Roundtable pointed out in the statement it released after the House passage of the bill yesterday, saying the deadline to raise the debt ceiling is rapidly approaching and the likelihood of triggering a negative market reaction with severe economic consequences will only increase as we approach the precipice. We call on the Senate to eliminate the threat of default by passing this bipartisan bill as soon as possible. That was the quote from Joshua Bolten, the CEO of Business Roundtable, and he is joining us now in studio to continue this conversation. So, Josh, thank you so much for being here. It is great to see you. At this point, we're all operating under the assumption that the Senate will pass this. It's just a question of when. And the bill that they are passing, is this the best possible outcome for the business community? They're not cutting spending so much that it's going to hit growth, but you're not seeing higher taxes. What is your membership's read on this package, aside from just it meaning that the U.S. isn't going to default?
Well, Kayleigh, we don't want to take anything for granted, so we're still pushing all the way to the finish line, which could be late tonight, could be tomorrow. We're feeling very optimistic, but we're, from the business community standpoint, we're continuing to push to get the bill across the finish line. Yeah, could it be better? Sure. But the most important thing is they are raising the debt ceiling, and that's what had a lot of the business community nervous, and that's what's settled a lot of nerves now. The bill that they've produced does several good things, particularly in areas like permitting that the business community stands strongly behind. But the main thing is raise the debt ceiling, eliminate the risk of default and economic cataclysm.
In the near term, sure. I mean, this ultimately only raises the debt ceiling for 2 years. And then thinking about the longer term implications, what does this really do to help solve the problem of the U.S.'s fiscal trajectory?
Well, it doesn't solve the problem of the U.S.'s fiscal trajectory, which is very, very troubling in the long term. But it's a first step. And it shows that you can get bipartisan agreement under duress, it turns out. But you can get bipartisan agreement to do sensible things. And so it's a step in the right direction, dealing only for the time being with non-defense discretionary spending, but putting some reasonable caps on. And hopefully there'll be opportunities in the months and years to come to tackle with the broader fiscal problem that the United States faces.
When you look at the broader fiscal problem, I think the Wall Street Journal did a good job this morning putting it into percentage of GDP. Right now, federal debt, 97% of GDP. Without the raise, 115% in a decade instead of, with the raise, with the package, 115% instead of 119%. It's so tiny. All of this brinkmanship, really for what? Do you think at some point would the business community try to lobby Washington to just get rid of the debt ceiling?
You know, the drama over the debt ceiling we would love to get rid of, because you all have been reporting on very, very accurately the turmoil that in the markets that causes, and Kayleigh was talking about what it even does to credit default swaps. But it does serve a purpose, which is to focus members of Congress on a deadline by which they need to take some action. And over the medium and long term, we would like to see action to actually be sensible about the fiscal trajectory of the United States, which currently, as you mentioned, is not good.
It seems to be replacing, though, regular order on Capitol Hill. And I don't mean to make you laugh here with that idea, but it's been a long time since we've seen the appropriations process go the way it's supposed to here. You were the director of the Office of Management and Budget. You've lived this. If not eliminate the debt ceiling, should we coincide it with the fiscal year to try to take a different angle here? Because we're still going to have to go through what could be a painful appropriations process, digging through the crumbs that are left from this deal.
Well, one of the good things that this bill did, and it did my nerdy budget heart good. Thank you for mentioning that 20 years ago I was the budget director back when we were worried about going over 40% debt to GDP ratio.
How far we've come.
And we're now at 100%. But there's what I think is a really good development in this bill that hasn't been reported on much, which is that the bill provides an incentive for appropriators in the Congress actually to appropriate.
They have another deadline.
They have another deadline. Don't just go to a continuing resolution, which means you got to spend the money in the same pots in the same amount. Make sensible choices, not just about how much you spend, but about where and the programs you spend it on. And what's included in this bill that I thought was a really cool development is that they've given the Congress an incentive to do appropriations bills. Because if they don't do the appropriations bills, they're going to suffer a 1% cut in what they get to spend.
Well, obviously, Josh, this is one big macro issue that the business community has had a wary eye on Washington around. But there also are other political issues now that corporations have to navigate. We are seeing it play out with Target, with Chick-fil-A. We've seen the saga with Disney. We know what happened with Anheuser-Busch and the Bud Light boycott. This pushback against woke culture, it seems to be all over the U.S., and companies have to deal with it. What are your message to the business community in this moment when they face such political ire and difficulty in navigating it?
Well, first of all, I think the business community is just going to be relieved now with knock glass that the debt ceiling will be raised, and we're not facing that cataclysm. But CEOs these days are under a lot of different kinds of pressures than they were even just 10 years ago to weigh in on political issues. We've got 230 CEO members of the Business Roundtable. All of them face those pressures. Most of them really just want to run their companies, and they express their values for the company through how they treat their customers and employees and suppliers. That's where most of them want to keep their focus. Occasionally they get dragged, mostly involuntarily, into political issues, as Disney did a few months ago in Florida. But most of them want to stay out. And our message to policymakers is, let business do business, and they should get to decide how they treat their customers and their employees. And then most of the CEOs say, if I'm allowed to do that, I don't feel that I need to get into extraneous political issues, which will only likely to cause more trouble.
Right, but when you look at the likes of Walgreens, sometimes different states are forcing them to make difficult decisions, and I imagine Mr. Bolten, is going to become much more difficult as we head to 2024. We thank you so much for your insight today. That was, of course, Josh Bolten, the CEO of the Business Roundtable. Coming to the program, our political panel will be here to discuss the Senate's race to pass the debt bill, potentially this evening or early tomorrow morning. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says his government is still considering its next steps ahead of a deadline imposed by the UK's official COVID-19 inquiry. Sunak's administration has so far refused to hand over former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's diaries and WhatsApp messages, those from the pandemic. They've argued that they're irrelevant to the investigation, and the approach has opened up Sunak to accusations he's attempting to cover up sensitive information. Wildfires in Canada have burned an enormous swath of land and forced thousands from their homes. Firefighters from across the globe have descended on the country to help douse the flames. More than 6.7 million acres have been scorched, the equivalent of more than 5 million football fields. That's more than 10 times the average area typically burned by this time this year. And Elon Musk's SpaceX has inked a deal with the Pentagon. The Defense Department will buy Starlink satellite communications terminals for use by the Ukraine military. U.S. military officials have praised the role that portable Starlink terminals have played in Ukraine since Russia's invasion. It's kept civilian population connected and provided crucial communications for the country's military. The government isn't disclosing the value of that contract. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Senators are racing to pass the debt bill in order to avert the default deadline. For more, let's bring in our political panel. Doug Heye, former RNC Communications Director, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner. Doug, so we're almost there. They're potentially voting this evening or early tomorrow morning. What do you think we're going to see in terms of the amendments? That seems to be what everyone's coalescing around. Will Lindsey Graham get the supplemental aid he wants for Ukraine? He said he even spoke to Zelensky about it today.
Well, I think they're going to probably get a promise that we'll address this at some point. You know, if any of these amendments are adopted, it means the bill goes back to the House, and we're right back at the drawing board. And I think what Kevin McCarthy did in the House was very skillful. President Biden negotiated well with him as well. But we go back to square one, and I don't think that's where anybody wants to be as we actually get into June proper and have that debt ceiling really coming pretty quickly.
Assuming this passes the Senate here, and that is the expectation, Kristen, we remind ourselves that at least in the House, it took more Democrats than Republicans to pass that legislation. If you're Joe Biden, after listening to Kevin McCarthy do more gaggles and news conferences than we could count over the last couple of weeks, how do you seize the moment? Does he sign this in a ceremony over the weekend? Does he do it right before the opening bell on Monday? What's the play?
I mean, I think it's a bipartisan agreement, and I would actually answer my own question. Is like you have to look at like the House. At least in the House, they're looking at how can we take back the majority, and a lot of these folks who are making deals like Hakeem, you know, the thing that wasn't really talked about was that, like, how did you get the rule, you know, to get to the actual bill? How did the Democrats actually give all their votes? You know, the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, made a deal on earmarks for Democrats, and that, you know, they're looking forward to the election to take back the House. So I think, you know, the president can take a victory lap. I think he's been a deal maker his whole career. People have underestimated him. He showed that that's still who he is.
When you look at, though, the tactics, there's some reporting that the White House had a tactic of telling Democrats to not go out and really tout this just yet because they did feel like they won. When you look at the things like work requirements, the Republicans are saying, yeah, we got to raise the age. Mm-hmm. But then as Congressman Clyburn just told Joe and I, and a little bit of what's niche there is actually they've expanded it for more people in America, the most vulnerable in America. That is a huge win for the White House. Was that a tactic they did? Just simmer, we can enjoy after we get this through?
I think that they must be very, very confident that the Senate feels like they have to do this. You know, I actually thought the same thing when I thought, okay, guys, let's not take a victory lap too soon. But, you know, the Senate, I think that enough senators, they must feel confident that, you know, that McConnell and Schumer have, you know, are going to bring enough votes to the table. And, you know, Doug was going through, you know, the machinations with the amendments and the deals that they have to make. But I think, you know, the Senate, the upper chamber is going to have to pass it.
Where are you on this whole narrative, Doug? You spent time in the Speaker's office. You know what's involved here, and you know what's probably going through Speaker McCarthy's head, because he won't have any of this. He says, no, we actually got concessions from Democrats that no one thought we could with such a razor-thin majority.
Yeah, if we go back to that Friday night in January where McCarthy was elected, and then the week after, there were so many articles. I went and Googled this earlier today that said he was a speaker in name only. He wouldn't be able to get anything done. He'd be run by his own conference. There's no reason for him to even be there. He's proved that narrative wrong. And this is significant for him moving forward because the White House views him very differently today than they certainly did in early January. This is a big win, regardless of what the policy implications are, which are not insignificant. Politically, this is a very big and important win for Kevin McCarthy.
Fascinating. Coming up, we're going to be back with our panelists to discuss the 2024 candidates heading to early voting states. It's getting crowded in Iowa and New Hampshire. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Republican presidential candidates heading to early voting states. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is now in New Hampshire. Donald Trump, many others crisscrossing Iowa, and we have more announcements to come next week. For more on the push towards the 24 presidential race, we welcome back our political panel. Doug Heye, former RNC Communications Director, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner. You're watching these candidates, I'm sure, Doug. Ron DeSantis is making his way from Iowa now in New Hampshire, and always the test. Is he affable enough? Is he natural in a crowd? Let's listen to him in action here as he takes a question from a reporter. He was actually meeting with voters in New Hampshire. You know how this goes. You have to meet everybody twice, shake everyone's hand, and sometimes town halls, Q&A, and so forth. This reporter was asking him about why he's not taking more questions from voters. Here's how he did.
Why not take any questions from voters, Governor? Governor, how come you're not taking questions from voters?
Not coming up to me, talk to me. What are you talking about? I'm not here working with people. Are you blind? What? Are you blind?
I'm not blind.
Okay, so people are coming up to me, talking to me, whatever they want to talk to me about.
I'm not going to ask you if you're blind, Doug, but is this the affable personality that you need to win?
This is something the base will love. And the reality is, and I've told reporters this so many times when we're doing events, you're here to cover the event. You're not a participant in the event. But when we go to these small diners and town halls and things like this in Iowa, New Hampshire, the early states, reporters often want to be the participant. This gave Ron DeSantis an opportunity to show in another way, I'm taking on the media, I'm standing up for you, and things like this. This works for him. But what we're also seeing happen is very clearly Donald Trump is viewing Ron DeSantis as a threat. He's making comments about him everywhere he goes. Trump's in Iowa right now. He's making up new nicknames. He's thinking out loud about what can I call Ron DeSantis next.
He sure is.
DeSantis is starting to make some real moves here in Iowa, in New Hampshire, as he's kind of launching his real part of this. And no one in Iowa and New Hampshire followed him on Twitter, so that essentially didn't happen. So these are his first steps, and we see that Donald Trump really wants to get in Ron DeSantis' way as much as possible.
Yeah, he clearly does. He's giving a town hall to Sean Hannity, right? So really going after the Republican base. This reporter, though, I have to correct you. He wasn't being a spectator, Doug. He was just asking a simple question.
He's asking the same question over and over again as he's talking and taking pictures with voters. Let the event happen, then talk to him outside. And then if Ron DeSantis is a jerk, all right, you've got footage that shows just that. Let him meet with the voters who were there to vote for him.
But the point is, it is just a question. I don't think the question was very hostile.
I don't think it was a hostile question, but when you're being asked the same question over and over and over again, answer my question, answer my question, answer my question, when the job is not to answer that reporter's questions, it's to talk to those voters in that diner, in that VFW hall, whatever it may be. The reporters are there to cover the event. They aren't part of the event. That's when you have the town halls with, a Sean Hannity or a CNN town hall. Yeah. That's where those things happen.
Then again, Kristen, he could have turned it into a laugh. He could have used some levity here, maybe won a couple of votes while he was at it, instead of those who already hate reporters. Maybe I'm crazy.
Seem a little bit more affable. I'm not on the Republican side. I think we look at things differently sometimes. I do think, though, clearly he's going through a primary, but you see what he's done in his actions, right? The Don't Say Gay bill until the end of high school. Right now, you can't. And with women's issues and women's health care and the choice issue, if he ends up being the candidate, and we're very early on in this primary, everybody thinks that nobody can beat Trump. I think anything can happen. Anything can happen. If he ends up being the candidate, I feel really good about running against him.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to always remind ourselves, right? We have more than a year to go. So, we have a lot of time here. Something also happened today. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, actually fell on stage. And I believe we have the video, so you could take a look at what happened yourself. When you think of 2024, Kristen, how much do things like this hurt him? Because the big question mark everyone has is, of course, his age. And could he do this for another 6 years?
I mean, I think he's been dealing with that question for a while, and you saw when he announced his reelection, he hit that head on. You saw Jim Clyburn, when he did his television, it was very clear that everybody wanted to hit this issue very head on. Yeah. His administration has been very capable. He's had enormous bipartisan wins. Everybody's underestimated him. Mm-hmm. I think he's going to continue to have to answer these questions.
Is it fair, though? Is it fair, Doug, to make... We're going to see this on the loop tonight, the loop reel of him falling off the bike, falling here. They'll show Donald Trump going down the ramp at West Point. Is this real?
I'll say something that I don't normally say. Donald Trump said something really interesting about this. And he said, I feel bad for Biden. That's a bad thing that happened. I tiptoed down a ramp, and that's all anybody could talk about. Yeah. And you might want to tiptoe and be more careful. He's actually right on that.
He
Right,
did trip over a sandbag and got back to
It's true. Something was in front of him, and then he pointed to it. All right, Doug High, former RNC Communications Director, and Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner, thank you so much for joining us. More of these stories on the Washington Edition newsletter.
You said it. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.